High above the European countryside, in 1943, the skies thundered with the sound of war. Hundreds of American B-17 SOs, soaring fortresses of steel, pressed deeper into Nazi territory. Their mission: cripple Germany's war machine by striking its factories, oil fields, and railways. But there was a problem. A fatal flaw. The German pilots knew it. The Americans knew it. Everyone in those skies knew it. Without fighter escorts, these bombers were sitting ducks. Every time the flying fortresses pushed past the range of their P-47 escorts, German fighters would descend like vultures. They tore through bomber formations with cannon fire and machine guns, while mocking radio chatter filled the airwaves. A Luftwaffe ace recalled later, "We called it the hunting season. The Americans were brave but foolish. Their bombers came alone. We laughed when we saw them." Entire bomber groups were shredded in minutes. Dozens of planes spiraled down in flames. Hundreds of airmen never returned. The dream of daylight precision bombing seemed on the edge of collapse. And yet, amid this nightmare, something was coming. Something the Germans did not expect. A new fighter. Sleek. Deadly. With the range to go all the way to Berlin and back. The P-51 Mustang. Its arrival would transform the skies over Europe. German pilots who once laughed would soon find themselves hunted, and the course of the air war would never be the same. This is the story of courage and tragedy, of arrogance and surprise. The story of how the P-51 Mustang saved the bomber crews and changed the fate of the war. But before we reach Berlin, we must first return to the dark days, when the bombers flew alone. By 1942, the Second World War had consumed Europe. Britain had survived the Blitz, but Germany's war industry thrived, churning out tanks, planes, and weapons that fueled Hitler's conquest. The Allies knew to win this war, Germany's factories had to be destroyed. But how? The British Royal Air Force, under Arthur Harris, turned to night bombing. Their Lancasters and Halifaxes struck under cover of darkness, blanketing entire cities with bombs. It was devastating, but imprecise. The Americans, however, had a different vision. The newly arrived 8th Air Force, based in England, was convinced daylight bombing could work. With advanced Norden bomb sites and heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses, they believed they could strike specific factories with surgical accuracy. They called the B-17 the Flying Fortress for a reason, bristling with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns. In theory, tight formations of these bombers could protect one another, like a moving fortress in the sky. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, was certain the bomber will always get through. But there was a catch. The bombers could only be escorted by fighters for a short distance. The rugged P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful, but lacked range. Once the escorts turned back over occupied Europe, the bombers were left alone, hundreds of miles from safety. The Luftwaffe knew this, and waited. Messerschmitt Bf. 109S and Focke-Wulf, Fulf. 190S, circled like sharks. Entire Jagdgeschwader fighter wings, trained to pounce the moment American escorts peeled away. The results were catastrophic. In 1943, raids over places like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Bremen left formations decimated. On one mission, nearly 60 of 291 bombers never returned. To the German pilots, it was sport. One ace, Günther Rauhl, later admitted, "We could not believe they would come without escort. It was madness, but we welcomed it." For the young American crews, it was slaughter. Casualties soared. To fly 25 missions was considered almost impossible. Many never reached 10. "Dear Mom, the odds are against us. Each raid takes more friends. But we have to keep going. We have to." The dream of daylight precision bombing hung by a thread. If something didn't change, the air campaign might collapse, and with it, the Allied strategy to break Germany's industrial heart. The skies over Europe had become a graveyard, and yet, the Americans refused to stop. But salvation was on the horizon. In secret hangars and test fields, a new machine was waiting, one that would rewrite the rules of the air war. The P-51 Mustang. The story of the bomber war is not just about machines. It is about the men who flew them. Teenagers and young men, barely out of high school, suddenly found themselves climbing into aircraft that would carry them into the heart of Hitler's empire. Most were no older than 20. They carried photographs of sweethearts, letters from home, and silent prayers that somehow they might survive 25 missions, the magic number that meant you could go home. They gave their aircraft names: Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, 909, painted with nose art. They became more than machines. They were companions in a struggle where the odds were merciless. One gunner, recalling his first mission, wrote, "When the fighters came, they came in waves. I froze at first, just staring at the tracers ripping toward us. Then training took over. We fired and fired, but it felt like trying to swat hornets with a stick." For the Germans, these were also young men. Many Luftwaffe pilots were veterans of the Battle of Britain, hardened and confident. They believed they ruled the skies of Europe. Some, like Erich Hartmann and Walter Nowotny, were aces with dozens, sometimes hundreds of kills. To them, each incoming bomber formation was a challenge, a chance to notch another victory. A German pilot later remembered, "The Americans were brave, yes, but to fly so deep without fighters, we laughed. It was suicide. We would form up and, like hunters, dive into them again and again." Inside those flying fortresses, it was terror. Oxygen masks frosted at high altitude. Gun positions were freezing cages. The roar of engines, the rattle of guns, the scream of incoming shells. It was chaos, every mission. Many crews never saw the end of their tour. Some were killed instantly when shells ripped through their bomb bays. Others bailed out, only to be captured, marched through hostile towns as prisoners of war. And yet, they kept flying. Why? Because they believed their sacrifice mattered. Every bomb dropped on a factory in Germany meant fewer tanks rolling toward Allied soldiers, fewer U-boats hunting convoys, fewer weapons raining down on Britain. For the men in those bombers, the war was personal. They were not just fighting for strategy or territory. They were fighting for survival, for their brothers in arms, and for the hope of ending the nightmare sooner. But with each mission, losses mounted. Morale trembled on the edge. And in Berlin, Goering and the Luftwaffe command grew bolder, certain that the skies belonged to them. The Americans were bleeding, their bomber crews shattered by the hundreds. Something had to give. And then came the breaking point. By the summer of 1943, the US daylight bombing campaign was reaching a crisis. Each mission pushed deeper into Germany, and each mission came at a staggering cost. The Americans were determined to prove that precision bombing could cripple Hitler's war machine. Targets like ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, and oil refineries were chosen with ruthless logic. If they could be destroyed, the Luftwaffe itself might collapse. But the Luftwaffe fought back with equal ruthlessness. German pilots developed new tactics. Instead of lone attacks, they struck in coordinated waves. Cannon shells tore through aluminum hulls, igniting fuel tanks, shredding wings. Some even launched rockets into bomber formations, turning the sky into a storm of fire. One American airman described the experience. It felt like flying into a buzzsaw. Fighters came head-on, guns blazing. You could see their faces, then they flashed past, and before you could breathe, more were climbing up from below. And if the fighters weren't enough, there was the flak. Black clouds erupted around the formations, deadly shrapnel tearing through engines and crews. The results were catastrophic. On August 17, 1943, the Americans launched one of their boldest operations, a twin strike against Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Regensburg built Messerschmitt fighters. Schweinfurt produced the ball bearings essential to nearly every German war machine. It was a daring plan, but disaster followed. The bombers pressed deep into Germany without escort. The Luftwaffe pounced. 60 B-17s were lost in a single day. Thousands of men never came home. Survivors limped back with torn wings, engines on fire, and crews dead or wounded. "We lost half our group today. My best friend Sep's plane blew apart right next to us. God help us if we have to do this again." The losses were so severe that even commanders questioned the future of daylight bombing. Could the Americans continue to bleed at this rate? In Berlin, Reichsmarschall Goering was delighted. He declared, No enemy plane will ever fly over the Reich. If they try, they will pay with their lives. For a moment, he seemed right. The Luftwaffe's confidence soared. The Americans were being ground down, mission after mission. And yet, the bombers kept flying. But how much longer could they endure? With every mission, the 8th Air Force edged closer to collapse. The promise of daylight precision bombing, perhaps the entire Allied air strategy, hung by a thread. Something radical had to change. And that change was about to arrive. By the autumn of 1943, the daylight bombing campaign stood on the edge of collapse. The losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force had been mauled, bleeding men and machines faster than they could be replaced. At Schweinfurt in October, another strike was ordered. Again, the Luftwaffe descended. 60 more bombers were lost. Hundreds of young airmen never returned. For the survivors, morale plummeted. Each mission briefing was like a death sentence. The faces of the crews grew gaunt, haunted by the knowledge that their odds of surviving were near impossible. One pilot later recalled, "We counted missions like men count breaths. Every time we went up, we knew we were gambling with death. 25 missions was a dream, not a goal." Meanwhile, Luftwaffe confidence soared. Goering boasted that the Americans were fools. German aces tallied victories with cold precision, certain they owned the skies. But behind the bravado, cracks were beginning to show. Each bomber raid, even when costly, struck deep into Germany. Factories halted, rail lines buckled, oil supplies strained. The Reich was feeling the pressure, and the Americans, though bloodied, refused to stop. Roosevelt and his commanders knew they could not abandon daylight bombing. To cripple Germany's war machine, they had to break the Luftwaffe. But how could they win a war in the air when their bombers were slaughtered by the thousands? The answer seemed impossible, until whispers spread of a new fighter, sleek and fast, with the range to fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin. Hope flickered. A new machine was ready, but could it deliver what the bombers so desperately needed? The American air war was at a breaking point. Without a miracle, daylight bombing would be abandoned, and with it, the promise of crippling Hitler's war machine before the Allies set foot on the beaches of France. And then, the Mustang arrived. It was unlike anything the bomber crews had ever seen. Sleek, fast, deadly. A machine built for speed, endurance, and destruction. The P-51 Mustang. Born from British desperation and American ingenuity, the Mustang began as a modest fighter design in 1940, but when engineers fitted it with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it became something extraordinary, a fighter with range, speed, and high-altitude performance unmatched in the war. With external fuel tanks, the Mustang could do what no Allied fighter had yet achieved: escort the bombers all the way to Germany and back. For the first time, the Americans had an answer to the Luftwaffe's dominance. The change was immediate and electric. Bomber crews who once looked the skies in terror now watched Mustangs zip past their formations, diving to meet incoming German fighters. The sight of their silver wings brought a surge of hope. One bomber gunner recalled, "When the Mustangs showed up, we cheered. For once, it wasn't just us against the world. They were our angels." For the Germans, the first encounters were a shock. Used to pouncing on helpless bomber formations, they suddenly found themselves hunted. Mustangs dove like falcons, their 6.50 caliber guns ripping into Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Ace pilot Chuck Yeager, flying the P-51, remembered, "The 109 Cess would try to climb, but we were faster. The 190 Cess tried to dive away, we caught them. For the first time, we owned the fight." In January 1944, as Mustangs joined the bomber streams in force, the balance of power in the skies began to shift. German pilots who once laughed at unescorted bombers were now dying in droves. The hunter had become the hunted. But this was just the beginning. The Allies had a weapon that could finally break the Luftwaffe. The stage was set for a decisive showdown in the skies over Germany, one that would decide the future of the war in Europe. In early 1944, the Allied strategy shifted. The bombers would keep flying, pounding Germany's factories, railways, and oil refineries, but now they would not fly alone. The P-51 Mustang became the long arm of the bomber force, reaching deep into the heart of the Reich. With their drop tanks, they could cross the channel, climb above the bomber streams, and stay there all the way to Berlin. And their orders were clear: do not merely defend, destroy. Under General James Doolittle's new doctrine, the Mustang pilots were unleashed. No longer were they tethered tightly to bomber wings. Instead, they roamed ahead, hunted German fighters, and engaged them before they ever reached the bombers. It was aggressive. It was merciless. And it worked. The Luftwaffe, once confident masters of the skies, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. Every interception became a death trap. For every American bomber shot down, more German fighters were lost. And unlike the Americans, Germany could not replace them fast enough. One Luftwaffe ace recalled with bitterness, "At first we thought it was a fluke, but then we saw them everywhere, above us, behind us, diving from the sun. It was as if the sky itself had turned against us." The impact was devastating. Luftwaffe kill ratios plummeted. Training schools rushed out half-prepared pilots to fill the gaps. By the spring of 1944, Germany's once proud fighter force was bleeding to death. And the bombers. For the first time, they struck targets deep inside Germany with a chance of survival. Ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, oil refineries, now within reach. The nightmare of unescorted missions was over. The P-51 had done more than protect the bombers. It had shifted the balance of the entire air war. But the true test, the decisive trial, still lay ahead. For the Allies had chosen a target that was not just strategic, but symbolic: Berlin. And when the Mustangs escorted the bombers there, the world would know the skies of Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. March 6, 1944. For the first time, American bombers set their sights on Berlin, the very heart of Hitler's Reich. It was more than a military mission. It was a statement. To strike the German capital in broad daylight and survive would prove to the world that the Luftwaffe's reign was ending. The Luftwaffe knew this was coming. Hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs scrambled into the air. For them, this was not just defense, it was pride, survival, and defiance. But this time, the bombers were not alone. The P-51 Mustangs swept ahead, above and behind, ready to meet the German challenge. One American pilot later recalled, "We saw them climbing, a wall of fighters rising from the east. The radio crackled. Then we dove. We hit them before they ever reached the bombers." The sky above Berlin became a swirling inferno. Mustangs and Messerschmitts tangled in deadly spirals. Tracers lit the heavens. Parachutes bloomed against the smoke-filled sky. For the Germans, the shock was total. Their old hunting grounds had become killing grounds for them. One Luftwaffe survivor admitted, "It was the day we realized the war was lost in the air. The Americans could reach Berlin, and we could not stop them." The bombers pressed on, dropping their loads over Berlin's industrial heart. For the first time, the Reich's capital burned in broad daylight, not from the RAF's night raids, but from the 8th Air Force, flying boldly under the sun. And this time, they came back. Yes, losses were heavy. Crews were killed, planes shot down, but the majority returned. The impossible had been done. Daylight bombers had struck Berlin and survived. The laughter of the Luftwaffe had died that day. From here on, they would fight a desperate, losing battle. The hunter had become the hunted. The war in the air had turned. The raid on Berlin was a triumph, but it was no victory without cost. Dozens of bombers still failed to return. Hundreds of airmen never saw England again. For every cheering crew that limped back to base, another was missing. Empty bunks, unopened letters, photographs left behind. One surviving navigator wrote in his diary, "We made it back, but half my friends didn't set. I don't know how to feel, relieved to be alive, or guilty that I am." For the Luftwaffe, the losses were even more devastating. Dozens of veteran aces fell from the skies that day, men who could never be replaced. German industry was straining, fuel was dwindling, and new pilots, barely trained boys, were being thrown into the fire. By the summer of 1944, the skies above Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. Oil refineries were smashed. Ball-bearing plants crippled. railways shattered. Without fuel, without parts, the Luftwaffe withered. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy, the once feared German Air Force could offer little more than token resistance. The P-51 Mustang had not won the war on its own, but it had made victory possible. It gave the bombers a fighting chance, stripped the Luftwaffe of its teeth, and opened the skies for D-Day. But none of it was free. The 8th Air Force alone would suffer more than 26,000 dead, more than the entire US Marine Corps in the Pacific. Entire towns in America were scarred by the loss of sons, brothers, and fathers who never returned. For the German side, the loss was just as profound. A generation of young pilots, sent up against impossible odds, was consumed in the inferno. The skies over Europe had become a graveyard, and yet from that sacrifice came the breaking of Hitler's war machine. The laughter of the Luftwaffe had vanished. In its place was silence, wreckage, and the long shadow of defeat. In the end, the P-51 Mustang was more than just a fighter plane. It was a symbol of resolve, proof that innovation, courage, and sacrifice could turn despair into hope. With its long range and deadly performance, the Mustang gave the bombers what they had always needed: protection. It turned the skies from a slaughterhouse into a battlefield where victory was possible. And in doing so, it helped dismantle the Luftwaffe, paving the way for D-Day, for liberation, and for the final defeat of Nazi Germany. But the cost remains etched in memory. Tens of thousands of airmen never came home. Their names are carved into stone, their sacrifice buried in foreign soil. For them, the sky was both their battlefield and their grave. One surviving airman decades later said simply, "When I see a Mustang fly today, I don't just see an airplane. I see all the boys who didn't come back. It reminds me that freedom isn't set free. History is not just about battles and machines. It is about people, their courage, their suffering, and the choices that shaped our world." The P-51 Mustang was a machine, but it was the men inside those cockpits and the bomber crews it shielded who gave it meaning. Together they turned the tide of the air war and wrote a chapter of history that still echoes today. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history. Together, we will continue to remember the voices, the struggles, and the sacrifices of those who lived and died in the Second World War.